Thank you for joining us this afternoon. If this is your first workshop with LEAD, welcome. If this is your second workshop with LEAD, welcome back. So before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that putting this workshop series is a team effort. So first of all, I'd like to thank Erin Shadwell for NAV for their support, DJ Rachel Ornitz, and also our colleagues from LEAD, Michaela Riven, and also our speaker, Kyrah Altman. And also, I want to acknowledge that we are still waiting on our ASL interpreter. So know that we have enabled the live transcription as we wait for the ASL interpreter to join us. So please click on more, and then the live transcript will be enabled. And we appreciate your patience, and thank you for understanding. So before I begin, also, I want to remind folks that LEAD is Let's Empower, Advocate, and Do, and it's an industry leader in mental health education. Kyrah Altman, LEAD's co-founder and CEO, will be leading again the second part of a three-part discussion series. Kyrah, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the great introduction. I'm so happy to be here. Also, I'm really grateful my colleague Michaela is here as well to join everyone. She's always super helpful when it comes to helping navigate the chat and also providing necessary follow-up. So I'm really happy to be here. This is really a fun training for me because we're able to dive deeper and build on some introductory topics and some ideas. So being able to dive deeper and really build some meaning, some context, and apply the knowledge that you've already learned is really the goal of today. And so with that, I'm going to keep us going. So per usual, we start off with a relax, reset, refocus reminder. So if this is the first deep breath you've taken today, take a few seconds, just take a nice inhale, hold it, and exhale nice and long and strong. And let's do one more big deep breath, a nice big inhale. Hold it and exhale. Long and strong. And the more that you do that, also, the easier it gets to really promote that exhale, which is really helpful for us to feel relaxed. So next we have reset. So what I want to ask you to do is do whatever you need to do to reset yourself today for noontime. So maybe shake it out a little bit if you hold some tension in your shoulders and your neck, maybe wiggle your toes, remind yourself where you are, feel grounded, and then finally refocus. So really try to set an intention for today. If you're like me, you're a multitasker, you might also have your computer up or also might be doing other things. It's really not great for learning. And I'm telling you that as someone who does it. So really set an intention for what you want to get out of today and how you're going to really prioritize that engagement to be able to take more and more from this. A little reminder, LEAD is the industry leader in proactive mental health and DEI education, but all of our DEI education like today is through a lens of mental health. So we look at how does language promote inclusion, belonging, equity, and also in the long term, promote psychological safety of community members at MIT and of people that we're working with. Now, with that said, again, my name is Kyrah, pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm LEAD CEO and co-founder. This is Daisy, who keeps popping up in the screen. She likes being very close to her mom's face at all times. And I will also bring any personal experiences to this that I can. Now, I want to hear from you all. So I would love to hear your first name and pronouns, your department or your affiliation at MIT. Maybe you lead a club or a department, or you're part of a group membership of some sort. And then finally, your reason for attending this second part live. And if you can, I'd like you to put this in the chat box all in one submission versus many. It makes it easier for me to read them out as they come in. And I'll give us a little bit of time to get some of those submissions in. It looks like we have 82 people live, 83 people live. Incredible. So let's hear from as many people as we can. And if I say anyone's name incorrectly, please, please, please tell me how to say it correctly. I really take that seriously and will try my best to keep working at it to get it right. And we'll talk today a little bit about mistake making and what we do when we get it wrong, because that's very real as well. All right, so we have Tammy, she, her, MIT Sloan Initiative on the Digital Economy, attending so I can learn to be more inclusive with my language. Awesome. We have Lori, she, hers, HST, joining to learn during dedicated time. And I would love for you to tell me what HST stands for. We talked about last session kind of acronyms and how sometimes we don't always know everyone's acronym. So I would love to hear where that or what that stands for. Shannon, academic administrator at CMS/W, she, her, hers, attending to learn how I am not being inclusive. Okay, very cool. Let's see. We have, and I'm not going to be able to read everyone, so I'm just going to read a few. Jen Marshall, MBA program, she, her, hers, continuing to learn how we can best support all of our students. Love that. All right. What else? Who else do we have? Jason, he, him, his department support program in MHH. I prefer in person to be able to ask questions in real time. Awesome. And I'm glad that you bring that up because at any point today, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, raise your hand, anything at all, or even put it in the chat box, we will definitely address that. Really, really awesome job, everybody. I will read one more. So we have Bria, she, her, hers, student conduct. Oops, I lost it. Student conduct and community standards, joining to learn how to best support students through our process. Awesome. All right, everybody. Well, I'm so glad that you're here, and I will definitely take some time to read through all of these after today's session. But for the sake of time, we're going to keep us going. And again, if you do use acronyms today, I ask you to actually let me know what those mean just for the lead team here, as well as anyone else who might just not be working in your department and might just not know where you are coming from. So with that said, why are we here? Set a little context and kind of circle back to last session. Inclusive and intentional language has many, many benefits, and it supports every single member of the community, not just the members of the community that are members of historically marginalized groups. Inclusion and belonging is good for everyone. It increases respect and mutual understanding. It builds new perspectives, ideas, and strategies, increases participation and involvement in other cultural groups or in other events or initiatives that support different groups. It increases trust and cooperation and helps define myths that promote inclusion, belonging, and equity. And of course, the reason we're here today is because we're looking at inclusion, belonging, and equity and how we can reach those very big, bold goals. Those are some very big words that hold a lot of weight, but through little pieces of changing our language. And little tweaks, little changes can go a long way. All of this is really going to bring us to a place where every student, every faculty member, every staff member at MIT can feel this sense of psychological safety. And that word basically means you're able to show up with your full, most authentic self. You're not hiding certain parts of your identity or leaving it at home, but you're showing up authentically, holistically with all of yourself. And you're not afraid of any negative consequences on your self-image, status, career, reputation, anything like that. Daisy thinks that she wants to stand in my lap right now because that makes a lot of sense. Excuse me, my love. We're teaching right now. Excuse me. Oh my goodness. All right. And a lack of psychological safety and being a member of a historically marginalized group are both powerful risk factors for mental illness. It doesn't mean that if you are a member of a historically marginalized group, you're automatically going to have a mental illness or struggle with your mental health. But what it does mean is it's going to increase your risk. And usually that's because of discrimination, racism, microaggressions, and even being around language that in very small ways, but consistently, chronically over a period of time, really beat you down mentally. And eventually that takes a very large toll on your mental health. So we're digging deeper because we can't really address mental health or psychological safety if we're not understanding the history that many people have experienced or how different identities affect their mental health or their sense of self. So we have to dig deeper. We have to look at things like injustice, inequality, oppression, racism, poverty. Like all of these things are again going to be risk factors for one's mental health. They're also risk factors or barriers to one achieving psychological safety in an academic setting. And that's, again, why we're all here today. So getting to learning objective 1, we want to practice identifying and correcting one's communication errors. Now, we talked a lot about this in the first session, and we gave you some very specific faux pas or things not to do in language. What we're going to do next is actually use some case studies and scenarios and see what you've learned. So it's going to be very interactive. I'm going to require every single person to be volunteering and helping us out today. Without that, it's going to be a very slow and boring session, which it definitely does not need to be. So please step up and help us out when you can. So we're going to start with this slide. We have 6 phrases here, and I'm going to go through each one and then ask individuals to volunteer. You can either raise your hand or simply unmute yourself and share. You can also chat about this in the chat box. Any way you want to contribute is fine. And I'd like you to tell me what is wrong with these statements, or what could be wrong, what might be being presumed or assumed about certain people or situations. So let's start with number 1. The student is learning about slaves in the antebellum South. What could be kind of tricky here in this sentence? What could we tweak or change that would make it more inclusive, more accurate even, more reflective of the actual antebellum South? I'm going to check out the chat and try to moderate that as well. So instead of slaves, right, enslaved people, or we could even go with person first language and say the people who were enslaved by others, right? So we're really being intentional about where that blame is being put in that sentence. Instead of just saying this person's entire identity is they are a slave, period, end of story, we're saying, no, this was a human being who had many identities and many pieces of who they were, and they were enslaved by other individuals for those other people's benefit. So it really helps us not only become more accurate and more specific with our language, but also more inclusive. Also pre-Civil War versus antebellum South, definitely. Yeah, great job, everybody. Okay. All right, and I don't know about the quote, Alan, that you're referencing, but we can definitely look into that later on if you can give us a little bit more information about that. Let's go to the next one. So number 2, we're learning about aspects of Asian culture like kimonos. So there are a few different things here. What do we think? We're learning about aspects of Asian culture like kimonos. Okay, so Asian should be capitalized for sure. Aspects of Japanese culture, right, versus just Asian, because there are many cultures and many countries and nations within Asia. There's South Asia, there's East Asia, there's all of these different places, right? And so by being specific, kimonos are specifically a piece of Japanese culture. So being really specific there, and also capitalizing the J in Japanese if we're talking about that. And kimonos also should have a capital K to them as well if we're talking about them in this cultural and in this very specific way. It would be different if it was, you know, aspects of Japanese culture like their dress, because that is lowercase dress. We're just talking about clothing that's different than an actual type of clothing that's very specific to their culture. And kimonos may be outside of Japan. I mean, culture is shared, right? It spreads, it is influenced, but it originated in Japanese culture. And so that's why we're talking about that in this case today. Let's go to number 3. The Hispanic student uses they, them preferred pronouns. Who can help me here? There's a few things again to look at. Okay, so instead of Hispanic, we could try Latinx or Latino, Latina, definitely if you know their gender identity. Also Hispanic, if you're leaving it, could be capitalized for sure. What else? So it should be personal pronouns versus preferred, because obviously being called what you want is a human right. That's who you are, that's your name, that has nothing to do with a preference. And also saying, the student uses they, them pronouns if you don't necessarily know that. So again, they might know that and they might be advocating for that student, but we don't know. It could be an assumption. We don't know. So we want to be careful. Also, why are we using these words as adjectives, right? Or descriptors? So does it add to the conversation to say the Hispanic or the Latino student uses they, them preferred pronouns? Is that relevant to the conversation? If we're talking about their pronouns, it might not be. Of course, if that student prefers identity first language or that is relevant to the conversation you're having, that's a different story. But also we have to take a step back and say, okay, why are we even including that as a descriptor in the first place? Awesome job, everybody. Let's go to number 4. I think I should tell the professor that his shoelaces are untied. What's wrong here? This is a trickier one. So yeah, instead of saying his, we could say their, because we don't necessarily know the professor's gender identity, their sex, their preferred pronouns at all. So we could say, we should tell the professor that their shoelaces are untied. Definitely. Awesome job, everyone. Next, I recently made my first queer friend. Who can help us out here? And we'll talk a little bit about tokenism very soon. Okay, so again, why do we need to specify this is a queer person unless it's relevant to the conversation in some way? So I recently made a friend is great. Also, the whole thing sounds wrong, correct? Like a lot of people are calling that out. The other thing too is, right, if you have a queer friend, or if you're categorizing or inventorying your friends in this way, that is very tokenizing. And that's very invalidating to folks that actually hold these identities, because they'll say, well, so I'm just your friend because of this identity that has potentially nothing to do with my friendship with you, right? Like it feels very off-putting. It's very invalidating and really just harmful. It's a microaggression in itself. The other piece, and I'm so glad we're bringing this up here, is don't use the word queer unless you have permission to do so. So queer is an umbrella term. It can incorporate a lot of different identities within the LGBTQIA 2S+ community. And it's used by many members of the community, which it is their right to use that word however they want to, right? I'm not a part of that community, which is why I'm saying they. Now, with that said, though, the word queer has been used as a slur in the past. And so because it's been used as a slur by folks not in that community, it's really important that we are not using that word unless someone has explicitly said, I identify as queer, instead of LGBTQ+ or whatever other identity that they want to, that they're sharing with you, right? And so it's important to make sure you're only using that if it is you've been given permission. Some other things. Also, don't out people without the permission. We're going to talk about that in a little bit too. Thanks, Amy, for that. Let me see if there's anything else. And again, the whole thing, right? It's just wrong. It's a microaggression in itself to say I made a queer friend. And usually what happens is, because I have that one queer friend, I know everything there is to know about queer folks, right? Or I'm now an ally, which again is problematic, because we know that you cannot become an ally. You practice allyship for a lifetime, and you don't get to check a box that says, oh, I'm an ally because I have a friend that identifies as lesbian or gay or whatever, right? That's not how that works. Okay, last one on this slide. Male and female students are applying to MIT from around the world. What do we think here? So students, right, making it a little bit more inclusive, students of all genders, definitely, because if we're saying male and female, we're actually completely ignoring non-binary folks, gender non-conforming folks, also transgender folks sometimes. So what we're saying here is that we are right now looking at gender in that statement in a binary way. There's only hot or cold, or night and day, or male and female, when we know in reality there's a lot of other wiggle room there on that really massive spectrum of gender. So students of all identities and backgrounds, remove the gender binary. Awesome job, everybody. All right, so it looks like you've learned a lot from the last session, so I'm really happy to see that, but things will get a little bit harder, so buckle up, get ready for some fun. All right, so next, we're gonna do 6 more. Here's the first one. I cannot wait to celebrate St. Patty's Day in 2022. What could be wrong with these statements, or what is wrong with these statements? I cannot wait to celebrate St. Patty's Day. Now, St. Patrick's Day is one of the most commonly exploited holidays, I would say, and appropriated holidays on college campuses. So we have, so St. Patrick, right? So being very specific about who the holiday is actually about. Great catch. What else? Can anyone talk to me about maybe what might happen at St. Patrick's Day, right? So how are you celebrating? That's a really important follow-up question. Do you just associate it with bars or binge drinking or partying, which is usually how most college students, if they're not actually celebrating it as a part of their culture, engage with that holiday, which is completely wrong, inaccurate, and really harmful and disrespectful to people who have Irish origin, right? It's very, very disrespectful. And so also understanding the meaning behind the celebration, understanding the cultural relevance, the history, those are all important pieces to understand a holiday. And even if you know all of those things, it still doesn't give you the right to go and still celebrate it. You need to be invited to celebrate that by somebody within the community. It's not your holiday to celebrate if it doesn't actually connect with your identities. Let's go to the next one. So who was that university speaker, and did he talk about his partner? And yeah, some awesome other resources coming for holidays. Love to see all of this. Thank you so much, everybody. So the number 2, who was that university speaker, and did he talk about his partner? So do you remember the name of who spoke recently? Did he provide his biography? So we're presuming some things here, right? We're presuming that the speaker goes by he or uses he, him, his pronouns. We're also presuming that this speaker is gay. And then we're assuming that the speaker has a partner. So there are multiple parts of this that come from assumption or presuming before you actually get to know somebody. Now, if this speaker was very outward and very open about, I am a gay man, I use he, him pronouns, and I have a partner, right? That's a very different situation. But if this sentence was said without that prior context, again, we're really allowing our biases to direct our views and our opinions about people versus actual accuracies that they tell us themselves. So how do we know his sexual orientation, right? Definitely. And again, these statements are not inherently bad. It depends on the context. It depends on if you already know this information or not, which is why we say what's wrong or could be wrong with these statements in the wrong context. Also, Lori makes a great point. Is his relationship or his sexual orientation or gender identity relevant at all to the topic that this person is talking about? What if they're talking about neuroscience or mechanical engineering and it has nothing to do with any of these other parts of their life? Again, we have to understand that people are human beings with many, many, many identities. And if you box them in, whether you're using not person first language or you're using texts like this, it can feel very isolating and very harmful. Yeah, really awesome. The other thing, I love that you brought this up, Piero, and please tell me if I'm saying that wrong. But so how do we know that the use of the word partner is assuming sexual orientation? I love that, right? So the idea that if somebody says, I have a partner, that means they're automatically gay or a member of the LGBTQ plus community, that in itself is an assumption that we're making that is really not an accurate one. And what really should be happening, I mean, I am a heterosexual person and I consider my boyfriend my partner. And I tell people I have a partner because I personally like the language of that better. I don't want a boyfriend. I want a partner in life, right? A partner in crime, a partner in all of those good things. And so I love that language. And when I say that to people, there have been multiple times when people have assumed that my partner is another woman, which is fine, right? But it's like, why are we assuming that? Why not ask? Why not actually take a step back and reflect on partner could be anyone, right? Okay, also, someone says my former partner was a cis bi woman. And so for those that don't know, cis basically means, or is short for cisgender, which means you were born with and you were assigned the sex that you also identify with in life. Cis bi woman who appreciated me using partner for her own visibility. Yeah, and so there's also that really important piece of identity within the queer or within the LGBTQ plus community when you're using that word as well. Again, friends, this stuff is super complex. It's super tricky. You can kind of talk through these things for hours and hours on end, but I'm so grateful that we're bringing up all of these different pieces here. And Julie says, I apologize if you've discussed this already, but can the term gender nonconforming be disparaging as if this is abnormal? Yes, it can. So actually, ideally, we want to use non-binary for someone if they identify as non-binary versus gender nonconforming. However, some individuals don't like that and would prefer gender nonconforming. So as we talked about in the last session, it really comes down to their preference. We want to stick with best practices, right? But at the end of the day, what matters is what somebody prefers, and if we're going to respect them enough to actually speak to them in the way that they wish, which we hope that everyone does here. Okay, next one. Hi, what are your pronouns? What's wrong with this? Okay, so Lori says, instead, let me see. Oh, so many great submissions here. Lori says, hi, my name is ... I use she, her, hers pronouns. Are you willing to share yours? Love that. So whenever you're asking somebody their pronouns, first of all, don't just ask individuals for their pronouns. If you think that they're a member of the LGBTQ plus community, you should be asking everybody their pronouns. We need to normalize pronoun usage. That's the first thing. The second thing is you need to offer up yours before asking somebody theirs. Pronouns are a very personal thing. These are our personal pronouns. They relate to our personal identity. So we need to say, hi, my name is Kyrah. I go by she, her, hers pronouns. Or if you're comfortable doing so, will you share your pronouns with me, your personal pronouns versus preferred? The follow-up question, which we talked about a little bit last session, is, are you comfortable with me using these pronouns publicly for you as well? Because if somebody shares their pronouns with you and they aren't actually sharing them with other people, you run into the situation where you might accidentally out them, which can also cause very serious and significant harm. So you always want to start by introducing yourself, offering up your own pronouns. Also know that some people prefer just to go by their name, and that's okay too. It's not their responsibility, and they don't need to share their pronouns with you, but it is our responsibility to ask individuals' pronouns after sharing our own to build inclusive spaces. Awesome stuff, everybody. Love it. All right. Okay, so with that said, let's go to the next one. As a transgender, have you had gender reassignment surgery? And I also want to just speak to the fact that many of these phrases are incredibly disrespectful and can also be perceived as microaggressions. So this is a learning environment. We're doing this because these are real things that are said out loud, but I apologize if this is triggering for anyone because these are very disrespectful phrases that we hear a lot. So let's see. So too personal and conflates gender with genitalia. Okay, what else? Yeah. Wouldn't even ask. Okay, so lots of things here. First of all, a transgender, that is completely demeaning and super disrespectful. People aren't a transgender. They may identify as transgender. They may be a trans person, but they're not a transgender. So you want to remove that language altogether. That's really not helpful. You also ideally want to use person first language. So a person who identifies as transgender, unless they've told you they identify as trans man, trans woman, whatever that might be. Also, asking somebody about their genitalia literally is so personal and so inappropriate. You would never go to somebody who wasn't a transgender person and ask them about what happens below their waist. Like that makes no sense. It's completely inappropriate, right? It's like asking someone, have you had a hysterectomy or have you been snipped, right? Like those are the types of very inappropriate questions you would not ask. Also, they have no relevance, most likely, to what you're talking about in an academic setting. So why do you need to know? This is incredibly disrespectful. This is way too personal. And then the last thing I want to mention here, gender reassignment surgery. So this also phrase really makes it seem like someone's gender is changing because of a surgery. What actually happens with transgender folks who are having gender affirming surgery, which is the better phrase for this type of surgery, is they are actually affirming the gender they were to begin with that was not reflected on their birth certificate or by whatever a doctor when they were first born assigned to them on that birth certificate. So instead of gender reassignment, we want to say gender affirming. All right, next one. What's it like to be Filipino? And are you first gen? So lots of assumptions here, right? What else? Wow, you have Filipino heritage. I'd love to learn a little more about your culture if you're willing to share. Love that, assuming you know that they have Filipino heritage, right? You have to make sure that that actually is offered up before just assuming that of someone. Definitely. This presumes so many things. And I hope that the theme we're all taking from this is stop and ask if it's appropriate to do so, but stop making these assumptions that are really harmful to people and box them into identities that they don't want to be boxed into, or that it's not your job to do that for them. It's up to them to kind of bring their identity to the playing field, not up to us to do it for them, right? Also microaggression for sure. There's also some assumptions that happen around socioeconomic status in the higher education space, as well as being a first generation student. First gen could be exclusive as well. And also assuming someone might be the first generation to attend college is also suggesting other things about their background. Again, very personal stuff and probably not appropriate for anyone that's not like a very, very close friend or family member. And it also might be trying to assume their immigration status. Again, we could dive so deep into all of these phrases. There's so much here to talk about. All right, last one. How long does it take you to wash your hair? And also, can I touch it? What is wrong here? Yeah, just no, nope, 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 nope. Shannon, that's very funny. Yeah, and I'm sorry if this is triggering as well, because this is unfortunately a very triggering experience, specifically that many Black women, but Black people in general face. Now, the other thing I also want to mention is when I say Black, the reason I'm saying Black versus African American also is because not all Black people are African American. Some Black people are from other places or identify with other heritages or ethnicities. So there's also that piece where you want to be specific there. So this is completely a microaggression. Most of the time people don't ask to touch your hair, and they just start touching Black individuals' hair. And it's completely intrusive, inappropriate. Consent matters, right? You don't just touch people ever without asking them or without being invited to. It's completely inappropriate, completely not okay, and really not even just a microaggression. It is an intrusion of your privacy and your physical space. The washing part, I get, but even the washing part, why do you care? Why is it relevant? Like that's not your business, right? We have to think about that. And yeah, we aren't petting zoos. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's very dehumanizing also. And people feel like they have autonomy to your body, like, or ownership of your body. Think about how horrible that must feel. All right. So moving on, some other things, and we're going to kind of skip through this a little bit quicker to get to the second half of today because time is always tough. With that said, some other incorrect language, specifically when we're talking about members of the LGBTQIA2S+ community, and even more specifically, transgender folks. So instead of saying that somebody was biologically male, biologically female, or even born male or born female, we want to say assigned at birth, because what actually happened was at the hospital, a doctor looked at this newborn baby and said, I'm going to put an F or an M on this birth certificate. That was it, right? There was no conversation. There was no additional like look at hormones or any of the bio or anything else. It was literally, let me put this letter on this piece of paper. So it's really important to use that language. Also, instead of sexual preference, sexual orientation. People are not choosing to, be a part of the LGBTQ+ community or be gay, for example. That is how they feel. They are gay. It's not just them acting or putting on any sort of, I don't know what the words are, but any sort of act that is a choice. It is not a choice. That is who you are. Just like your gender identity is who you are. And it should be accepted and appreciated at face value. And then finally, instead of somebody who changed gender, because again, they didn't, they may have transitioned or gone through gender affirming surgery versus the other form of surgery that we talked about, or the other phrase to describe that. All right, so not everyone is going to be happy when we start using inclusive language. Let's be really real for a second. Not everyone's going to be happy with it, especially outside of the academic setting and outside of academia. People are a lot more sensitive to this language, or I guess to the correcting of this language, I should say. So they are not necessarily all for the inclusive piece, or they don't necessarily understand the benefits of using this very intentional language. Sometimes we have something called coded language or coded backlash, which are very soft or gentle phrases that really are actually saying a lot more hurtful or harmful things. So I'm going to give you one example. Some folks might say, well, I want to make sure everyone is treated the same. So I want to focus on equality over equity. Who can tell me what's wrong with that? And I'll also say, as you're thinking about that, right, usually the challenge for people for being inclusive is it inconveniences them, which is literally showing their own privilege in that in itself, right? If this is inconveniencing you, that means you've never actually been on the receiving side of it and you've never had to deal with it. So you don't even understand the privilege of being able to not be inclusive with your language. Okay, I would love to explain the difference between gender and sex. I'm getting a few other things, as well as the LGBTQIA2S+ acronym. We don't have the time for today, but I will be hanging out after this. So if you want to hang out with me after, I can definitely address those questions then. Okay, also Lori says equality means everyone gets the exact same. Equity means everyone has the same opportunity, resources, and assets, or they get what they need, which is so much more important. So with all of that said, it's important to really remember that coded backlash exists, and even if it sounds soft or well-intentioned, it still could be incredibly harmful to many people in our community. All right, so we need to be able to acknowledge and apologize when we make mistakes, and we're going to make mistakes. That is part of being human. That's also part of the fact that English in itself is a newer, younger language. So as it evolves and as it changes, and as we become more specific with our language, we're going to keep having to evolve our own personal vocabulary and be more specific and change with it. With that said, the number one thing that most people fall into the trap of is basically making an apology about you and not about the person that you've harmed. So we're going to talk a little bit about that next. Okay, so how to apologize. Don't make it about you or overdo it. What I mean by that is, let's say you use someone's incorrect pronouns. You stop yourself, you say, listen, I'm really sorry, I meant to say this. And then you keep going on in the conversation. If you stop and you say, I meant to say this, I'm so sorry, and you spend 5 minutes talking about how horrible you feel and how horrible they must be looking at you now, and you're really looking for that checkbox of, yes, you're forgiven, you're fine, you're making it about you versus them, and you're not really acknowledging the harm that they may have felt when you did just use those incorrect pronouns. The other thing you want to do is thank someone for sharing their feedback or their feelings with you and validate that. If someone says, I'm really hurt by what you just said to me, or I'm really offended even by what you just said to me, you can say, I am so sorry you're feeling that way. And I'm so sorry that what I said was offensive, right? You don't want to just focus on, I'm sorry you're feeling this way, but what I did has weight and is going to impact you. And I want to acknowledge that. You want to take that blame if you can. You don't want to expect or feel entitled to forgiveness. And remember that the impact is always greater than the intent. So even if your intent was super, super positive and loving and kind, it doesn't really matter if you still harmed someone else. So you still need to acknowledge it and you still need to apologize. Okay, moving forward, don't brag about your apology later on or your wokeness to other people because you think that you're so mature, so woke, so much of an ally, and so on. Don't apologize publicly if you haven't already apologized personally to someone that you've harmed, and if that public apology is rooted in optical allyship, which we'll talk about next. And finally, once you have made that, either it's a microaggression or a mistake in just your language, do the work on your own to learn why what you did was wrong, to challenge your existing biases and your bad habits. We have habits, right? If you, for example, if somebody has transitioned, or if somebody, for example, if somebody was, I'm not even going to that, that's a whole other thing. Sorry. Anyways, Follow up, and you want to check in and share what you learned from putting in the work on your own. So what that means is once you have taken the step back to educate yourself, to learn where you went wrong, you might want to, a few months later or a few weeks later, follow up with that person that you harmed and say, hey, again, I'm really sorry that I harmed you in this way. I want to let you know the work I did so I won't do this again. Making sure that you're not going to repeat that harm is one of the most important pieces of a true, authentic apology. Okay, so I want to go to this case study. Let's say, actually, I'm going to go here. So an MIT student asks another student, but no, where are you really from? After the student told them of their hometown in North Carolina. So in this case, right, somebody is saying, but no, where are you really from? They might be well-intentioned and just want to get to know this person a little more, but regardless, it can really feel isolating and really disrespectful to someone who's saying, no, I'm from North Carolina. Why are you making these other assumptions about my identity? So, excuse me, in this situation, how should we react? We have three people to think about: the student that's perpetrating this microaggression, the student who's been made victim of the microaggression, and a staff member who knows both students and is watching this all take place. Who can break this down for me? Maybe somebody can unmute and help me out here. What could be done differently next time? What might be a positive reaction or a helpful reaction in this case? Feel free to raise your hand, unmute, whatever you need to do.
The student who perpetrated the microaggression hopefully might realize that they said the wrong thing and just apologize. Like, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that question. You told me you're from North Carolina.
Definitely, right? Like, I'm sorry for not listening to you when you told me where you're from. It's completely invalidating. So I'm sorry that you didn't feel heard, right? Or that I didn't hear you when you spoke to me recently. Awesome job. Shannon says the student who was made victim shouldn't have to do anything, but might say, I just told you where I'm from. Are you asking about my heritage? Right. Or that student can go and get additional support from their support system, because when you are a victim of any microaggression, it's really, really detrimental to your mental health. And you might need to go and get that additional support, whether it's from the university or it's from your immediate support system. And finally, the MIT staff member who's watching this all go down, how could that staff member let this be or build this into a learning opportunity for everybody? What's something that they could say? And I know a lot of people are resonating with this. Margaret says, I hate it when the cab driver asks me that. I say Atlantic City. I've been asked that many times too. Also always repeatedly called exotic. Oh, you look so exotic. Where are you from? Like, from Worcester, Massachusetts. Not that exciting. Yeah. So pull the microaggressor aside and explain why what they said was a microaggression. I love that, Emily. I think that that's really, really helpful. The only thing I would change is using person first language with the person that said or perpetrated the microaggression. The reason for this is that, again, we're all humans. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to say the wrong things, but it's important to also not fall victim to the attribution bias, which is basically saying, if I make one mistake, I'm a terrible human being, because that can also be really detrimental to your mental health as well. You are going to make a mistake, and it's still your job to learn how to not make that mistake in the future and apologize effectively, right? Making it about them, not about us. But you still doesn't necessarily mean you are a horrible, racist human being who should never see the light of day, right? That's also not what we're looking for here. Okay, so let's chat really quick. What impact does a sincere apology have on someone who's been a victim of a microaggression or discrimination? I would really love somebody to unmute and share a personal experience of getting an actual sincere apology from somebody and how that affected you personally. Let's make this really come close to home. Also really great comments from Jason in the chat too. Can anyone share an example of what a really sincere apology did for them? How it affected them? All right, I'm going to keep going for now, but if you'd like to share, please feel free. Now, before we go on to the last learning objective, which we're almost there, I just want to remind everyone that doing nothing is not the answer. So if you are witnessing a microaggression, if you are witnessing harm of any means, if you're able to do so mentally, of course, and safely, it's important that you do say something. And it's also important to not keep the fear of saying the wrong thing from saying something altogether. You're never going to be perfect. I, as your instructor, am never going to be perfect. I have to live with that every single day, and I learn things from all of you every single day as well. With that said, we still need to act despite that fear and really acknowledge that we are always learning. And this continuous process of learning, apologizing, reflecting is part of practicing allyship. So it's a constant choice that we make. Michaela's also referencing a really incredible author, speaker who talks about always doing better in every single moment. Okay, so finally, we want to adopt cultural humility. That's exactly what we're talking about right now. And also avoid optical allyship, which is basically allyship that makes us look good, but actually has nothing to do with taking acknowledgement or accountability for the harm that we just did. With that said, optical allyship is a term coined by Latham Thomas. It's defined as allyship that only serves at the surface level to platform and elevate the ally. This is incredibly destructive and harmful. With that said, you can see a few examples here of what performative or optical allyship looks like. So it could be optics, centering yourself, your statement that is appearing after you were called out, but not actually apologizing to the individual that you harmed. Bandwagoning, PR, really trying to make yourself look better or look woke and accountable when that's not actually where your actions are following up. Also, if you're not actually doing the work on your own, and maybe you're asking someone else, a person of color, for example, to do the work for you and tell you what you did wrong, again, that's not the way to do this. People of color, members of historically marginalized groups are already drained because of these daily experiences. It is not their job to educate white folks or people that are not members of their communities. Okay, last case study for today. MIT wants to host an event to celebrate Pride Month in June of 2022. What are the first 3 things MIT organizers should do or think about to ensure accurate representation and celebration of the LGBTQIA2S+ community? So we're thinking about a Pride Month event here. How can MIT host this event where it's really authentic, helpful, supportive, and not performative or optical? What might we be looking at? So involve members of the community in the planning and the leadership of the planning, definitely. Involving members of the community, for sure. What else? Continuously process our biases, definitely. A lot of us know how to act right, but it's on top of a whole lot of mess, definitely. All right, so here are some other things to think about, and there's a lot here. So I'm only going to mention a few of them, but feel free to take a picture with your phone if you want to look at these a little bit after. And of course, the recording is going to share all of this as well. So some things that MIT could do, again, when they're thinking about catering the event, right, or having vendors at the event, making sure that they're supporting LGBTQIA2S+ owned businesses and individuals when planning to compensate them for their time, their expertise, and actually support their businesses. Other things could be creating an educational component to actually educate folks within the MIT community about the acronym, about what being or practicing allyship for this community actually means and looks like within an academic community. Destigmatizing and normalizing pronoun usage. Let's say you have a Pride Month event, right? But nobody uses pronouns at that event. That's the same thing as saying something like folks with the X at the end, like we talked about in the last session, but not actually having an inclusive space for those folks to join. So we have to make sure what we're saying matches up with our actions. Other things might be attending a virtual or an in-person Pride parade if you're invited to do so by someone in that community. And even if you were invited, you want to also be aware of the space you take up in these settings or at these events. Things you don't want to do are pretend to be a member of this community, because that again perpetrates this idea that you're choosing to be a part of this community versus that is your identity. You don't want to misgender folks. You don't want to host an event without the leadership or the support of this community, and really try overall to avoid that performative or optical allyship. Remember, apologizing and taking accountability for harm caused by your actions is really, really hard to do. Apologizing sucks, right? For lack of a better way to say it, it really is hard to do because we beat ourselves up. We're upset that we didn't do better. It's hard to also acknowledge when we did hurt somebody if that wasn't our intent. It feels very conflicting internally. It is super hard, but I want to remind everyone here, we can do hard things, and hard things also get easier with practice. So the more you practice apologizing and taking accountability, the easier this will get in the long term. But again, remember that it's not just about the authentic apology, it's also about the action that comes after that as well. Cultural humility is our goal. We've talked about this already a lot today. It's a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique, and it's also aspiring to develop partnerships and connections with people that are really authentic and not based in tokenism, that really allow you to engage with people from different backgrounds and who are different than you. Additionally, if you hear of a microaggression or if you see harm that's going on, you also should 100% reach out to MIT's Institute Discrimination and Harassment Response Office, IDHR. This is a really fantastic resource for you as well that most universities do not have. So again, it's a privilege, right, to be a part of this incredible MIT community that prioritizes this and has this resource for you. Now, our next time that we're going to be meeting together is a debrief session that will really allow everyone just to kind of debrief, discuss, talk through some of these really complex and deeper topics. With that said, I have 2 homework options for you prior to that debrief session, and I really, really encourage you to choose one of them because I will ask to recap what that was like at the beginning of our debrief. So the first option, create a list of all the topic areas related to DEI or diversity, equity, and inclusion that you need to learn more about and set SMART goals to do so. Homework option number 2, explore how you can actively support historically marginalized folks on MIT's campus and in your future professional life. So I really want you to take a picture of this slide if you don't have this written down and spend at least 30 minutes thinking about this in a really deep, intentional way prior to our next practice session. Final question for all of you today. What is your biggest takeaway from today's webinar, session 2 of our Power of Language series? So again, feel free to unmute yourself or put it in the chat. And again, and also Rachel put the link for the debrief event in the chat. So please, please click on that, register, do what you need to so we can see you there as well. What is your biggest takeaway from today? And I want you to think what's different about today versus last time, right? What were you able to apply this time, or what kind of clicked for you that maybe didn't click in our last session? So the importance of intervening in the face of microaggressions, definitely. Yes, and I'll put the homework slide up one more time. It's not about me, it's about them, definitely. Language is powerful. Definitely, definitely. All right. With that said, everybody, we want to make sure this is not the last time that you're talking about mistake making, about diversity, equity, and inclusion, about any of this important stuff, which is why we have this really awesome debrief scheduled for November 15th. We're going to continue to dive into these topics. I encourage you to come to just keep leveling up in this knowledge base that you're building. Additionally, we at LEAD will make sure that you're a part of our educational newsletters and our specific exclusive Facebook group for continuing education as well. We also have this really wonderful resource guide. It's 40 pages long. You will get it if you're able to help us out by filling out this 3-minute evaluation survey. This also helps me understand how I can improve when teaching this material, as well as how LEAD can continuously really maximize our impact within higher ed communities. So again, please click that. It only takes you 3 minutes. Thank you all so much for your time, your vulnerability, and your engagement today. As promised, I'm going to hang out and answer any other questions that you might have. I'm happy to do that. So please feel free to stay, ask me questions, and I'm here until everyone else is gone, and then we'll go from there. Thank you all so much for 2 wonderful sessions, and we'll see you at the debrief.
Thank you, Kyrah.
I'll make sure to include the homework options in the post workshop resources so everybody can have that for viewing as well.
Does anyone have any other questions? I know I was already asked, just thinking back to the chat, I was asked the difference between sex and gender. So that is actually a really common thing that people confuse. So I just want to also just normalize that that is a good question to ask. And I'm glad you're asking it versus assuming what those things are. So sex is really based in biology or in your physical parts, right? So that is what happens when you are born. A doctor looks at you and puts a letter on your birth certificate. Whether that's accurate or not is a separate issue, and how they actually determine what letter they put is another really big problematic separate issue. But again, sex is usually connected to your physical body parts. Gender, however, or your gender identity is how you actually feel about your entire holistic self. So it's much more all-encompassing, and that actually honestly matters more for the most part than sex, because gender identity is how you connect with the world and how you see yourself, when sex is literally just what your body might look like. And that, again, is very problematic because our bodies are more complex than that. Our brains are more complex than that. There's a lot more wiggle room there on that spectrum. I'm trying to think if there were any other questions I saw. Oh, another question was about the LGBTQIA2S+ acronym. So that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer or questioning, intersex, asexual, and then two-spirit, which is a recent addition that really helps erase the invisibility of Indigenous people. In many Indigenous nations, two-spirit individuals or people that served that purpose or that role were very, and still are very highly regarded, celebrated, appreciated within their communities. And two-spirit individuals do not identify with just one specific gender, and they play really important cultural roles in those communities. And awesome, glad that we're still recording. Any other questions? Or Michaela, if you wanted to add anything to those two, feel free as well.
You did a fantastic job of overviewing it. I would say, I mean, there's always more to learn. I think we talked about a little bit earlier in the session too, when we're talking about gender non-conforming and kind of thinking about non-binary instead, but it's really up to the individual, and the plus is there because we're always expanding. There's a really fantastic Boston-based gender consultant and activist named Matisse DuPont, who, and I'll share this in the post-workshop resources as well, who really talks about, as many people as there's ever been, that's how many gender identities and sexual orientations that there are, just because we're all our own person, right? We all have our own preferences, and really thinking about what makes sense for you. So if an individual identifies as gender non-conforming and they're comfortable with that, great. If they identify as agender, right? They don't identify with having a gender. That's something that's very common as well. So it's really just, like we said, up to the individual and respecting folks and their identities.
Definitely. And I also want to add too, I think one of the other things that's very tricky about the acronym, because it's longer, is also because it incorporates different things. It incorporates different sexual orientations, which is right how you connect or what you're attracted to, who you're attracted to, as far as either sexually, romantically, or even just emotionally. So that is sexual orientation. But then we also have within the acronym gender identity, and then we also have within the acronym sex. So those three different categories of terms are all encompassed into that one acronym, which is also sometimes challenging when you're trying to talk about a specific group. So again, just like we were talking about, being specific with Asian, so instead of Asian, Japanese, right? In the same way, if you're talking about folks that are transgender, you want to be specific, not just say, oh, folks in this LGBTQIA2S+ community, because you might be talking about something that's specifically only relevant to transgender folks. So when you can, be specific and be intentional with what language you're using. All right. Well, I'm so grateful to be here. I think we should maybe stop the recording now. And if anyone else has questions, feel free to reach out to me if you'd rather talk privately. I'm happy to do that. I think I'm going to put my email in here again. I'm sure Michaela already put it in there too.